Welcome to another episode of Broken English Straight Facts.
I don't know if you guys are like me because I just realized I haven't been paying attention to the situation in Ukraine for the longest. And I don't know, it feels like so much has been going on lately. The news cycle has been changing every other week, so I've totally lost track. Now, Ukraine is back in headlines again. So I was just looking at a few articles and I thought now is as good a time as any to catch up on the developments of the war between Ukraine and Russia. So let's get right into it.
So this is gonna be brought to you by Defense News. Article was published on July 2nd, 2026. Let's go.
Russia bombards Kyiv in one of war's biggest strikes, at least 21 people killed. Russia launched hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles at Ukraine's capital Kyiv in the early hours on Thursday, killing at least 21 people, wounding scores more and damaging around 130 buildings in one of the biggest attacks of the war. Multiple explosions shook central Kyiv and reverberated across the capital throughout the night as thousands of residents rushed to bomb shelters and underground metro stations. Huge columns of smoke filled the skyline. The attack was the deadliest in Kyiv since at least May, and the wide spread of destruction across the breadth of the capital had little precedent even in a war now in its fifth year.
I have to say this. It's unfortunate that war results in as many casualties as it does, and the fact that our leaders are not motivated or pressed by the number of casualties that war brings to be able to pursue peace is one of the few things I haven't been able to figure out. In the last episode, we were looking at how the South Africans were turning on fellow African migrants. And I remember at the time they had reported that there had been migrant casualties as a result of the xenophobic protests turning violent. And I felt that that was a line being crossed that should all make us just pause and take a breather. And I feel the same way right now about the situation ongoing in Ukraine. When you have this number of lives being lost, and I don't know how many more have been lost before this reporting. I haven't been paying attention to the situation personally, but I can imagine that there's been lots more. It probably is even in the thousands. And I would want to think that there's a certain death toll which ought to prick people's consciences and make leaders want to push for peace more aggressively. So this is just the first week of July. We're talking about 21 people. We're talking about 130 buildings having been the target of drone and missile attacks from Russia. I can only imagine what that situation is like. And for someone that comes from a third world country, we really don't have a lot of the infrastructure that Ukraine boasts, especially critical infrastructure that could protect their citizens in the event of an aerial attack. You've got bomb shelters, you've got perhaps even, what do they call them? Sirens and different ways of alerting people that we are in a state of war, and that signals for everybody to take cover or to take shelter or to go underground. Ukrainians are lucky to have this, and if you come from a country where this infrastructure exists, you've got something to be thankful for. This is not a luxury people from Africa have. When war breaks out, there's literally nowhere that you could hide. But at the same time, I want to believe that human life is the most precious thing that there is. And I want to believe that when leaders are seated side by side each other, having diplomatic talks, the blood being spilled every other day should be enough motivation to get the piece done. And I feel like that's such a simple point to make, but it's unfortunately the one thing that's lost in translation whenever you have world leaders showing up for talks. Everyone seems to want to be sizing up the other. They act as though there's margin for error, when the bottom line is this, that whenever attacks happen, it's the civilians that get caught up in the crosshairs. So it's really unfortunate that we're looking at 21 people whose lives have been upended just on the first week of July. Now, I haven't been paying attention to what's been going on since the Ukraine war started. So the numbers could be a lot more scarier. And if they're getting anywhere to the thousands, this should have been enough. Like, it shouldn't even have had to get here before leaders are seated at the table and aggressively pushing to have the war ended on mutually amicable terms. But let's carry on. There's probably a reason why all of this hasn't ended sooner than we desire it to.
President Volodymyr Zelensky, who cut short his visit to Ireland and rushed home, visited a site on the city's left bank where a 9-story residential building was half destroyed. He blamed the destruction in part on a failure of allies to deliver promised air defenses. If our partners had delivered on their promises in a timely manner, I think we could have saved more homes and lives today, said Zelensky, who looked tired and visibly frustrated. All we ask of our partners is simply to do what we've agreed on. We're not even asking for more.
Now, I don't know whether Zelensky understands the implication of laying the blame on Ukrainian allies for not being a friend in need, you know. For the longest time, the EU has been the only bloc that I feel has been 100% on the side of the Ukrainians. What I think is the issue is the EU has only supported Ukraine in as far as sanctions are concerned, in as far as financial aid is concerned. But when it comes to supplying troops on the ground, either the EU doesn't have men to send, or the EU believes, oh, let the Ukrainians die on the front lines protecting the rest of us from the advancing Russians. That's my cynical view on the situation. I, for the longest time, felt that even though Ukraine feels a strong sense of national pride to stand up to the Russians, looking at the military strength of the Russians versus the Ukrainians, it was only a matter of time before the Ukrainians started to tap out. And it doesn't matter how you slice it. War is a matter of numbers, especially in the age of the machine, in the age of industrial production. War is a numbers game. You either outproduce the enemy in terms of weapons, or you've got more men in the reserve. And looking at the populations of both the Russians and the Ukrainians don't have enough people. They don't have as many men as the Russians. In terms of raw industrial production, Russia's production far outpaces that of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are literally hoping that Europe will send its men to fight on the front lines with them. Ukraine's plan is that the US and NATO will get themselves involved so that Ukraine can have a decisive advantage over the Russians. But in order for that calculation to be made by anyone, entire countries, not just the leadership, the citizens have to be bought in. And if there's a time that the West is domestically fractured, it's never been to the extent that it is right now. Since COVID, you're not gonna get any country backing foreign wars. That's just not gonna happen. So the Ukrainians have got themselves into a bit of a pickle because they're engaged in a war where their chances of victory hang on a decision abroad that's never gonna happen. So, of course, Zelensky is right to be frustrated because he's in a jam. I'm not going to say he got himself into it, but he's in a jam where he thought he could get out of because his friends assured that they were coming with backup. And you know what? They are not. They're willing to throw all the money they have at the Ukrainians, but they're not willing to throw men. They're willing to throw all the sanctions they can at Russia, but they're not willing to empty their arsenals, send all their artillery, and be left with nothing. It's too great a risk for them. And yet, Ukraine's victory rests on the European allies, along with the Americans, expending themselves to support Ukraine in its effort to push back the Russians. I mean, choose your friends wisely, but also know your friends' strengths and weaknesses so that you don't have false expectations of them. because whatever illusions you have about your friends, that's what gets you, because they'll fail you, and it's only because you had certain assumptions, you had certain illusions about their capabilities. Choose friends wisely, but also don't delude yourself about their strengths and their weaknesses so that you don't have false expectations of them. Let's carry on.
Russia launched 74 missiles and 496 drones overnight, the Ukrainian Air Force said. Yuri Anat, the Air Force spokesperson, said the number of ballistic missiles was unusually high and the interception rate for them was low. Ukraine has struggled with shortages of Patriot missiles in recent months. The Russian Defense Ministry, in a Telegram post, said its massive attack using long-range, high-precision air, land, and sea-launched weapons and drones hit military and energy facilities, as well as airports in Kyiv and other locations. Moscow said the attacks were retaliation for Ukrainian drone strikes on Russia. Kyiv, which has stepped up strikes in recent weeks on Russia's domestic fuel supply, said it had hit an oil refinery overnight in the Russian region of Nizhny Novgorod, where the governor reported one person killed in a strike on an industrial facility. The Kremlin said Russian military commanders had briefed President Vladimir Putin about the Russian attacks, adding that Moscow would continue to increase pressure on Ukraine to achieve its war aims.
That's really unfortunate because, as you can see, the Russians are justifying their missile and drone attacks on a previous attack by the Ukrainians into Russia, And so Ukraine got hit back. So the Russians are not denying the attacks. Their defense ministry confirmed it on a Telegram post, and the President Vladimir Putin is apprised on the developments, and their rationale for the missile and drone barrage was in retaliation of the Ukrainian drone strikes on Russia. And it seems that Kyiv had been targeting Russia's oil refineries and trying to cripple its domestic fuel industry. So this was pretty much a retaliatory attack. Now, my point still stands that when you have casualties from your own citizenry, at some point, leaders have to prioritize ending a war.
Thank you for watching this episode of Broken English Straight Facts.